Hello and welcome to the final lecture on Look Back in Anger, which we'll cover today. So we spent 4 lectures already on this particular play by John Osborne, and I've given you the background of the play, the historical background of the play, the cultural conditions of the play, and we also talked about the gender politics in the play, the different kinds of embodiment, the different kinds of performativity that are present in the play, and the very complex relationship between gender and class that we see throughout the play. So we talked about in the last lectures about the gendered quality of anger, the gendered quality of hysteria, the gendered quality of rhetoric that pervades the play. So what we'll do today is I'm going to sort of look at a specific scene, the final scene of Look Back in Anger. Because prior to that, we had already looked at another scene, which was Act 2, Scene 2, the scene where Colonel Redfern had appeared in the play. And the reason why we looked at that particular scene is because it was a very interesting scene in terms of looking at the kind of gendered identity he embodies. Colonel Redfern. So Act 2, Scene 2 was a very crucial scene in the play where we compared and contrasted the kind of masculinity embodied by Colonel Redfern with the kind of masculinity that Jimmy Porter embodies. So imperial, dominant, confident masculinity contrasted with a post-imperial, exhausted and neurotic kind of masculinity. So we've done that already. So what we'll do today, what I'll sort of just go through in some details today, is the final scene in Look Back in Anger, where obviously the setting is, this is where Allison comes back in the play. And we've seen in the previous scene that how Helena had moved into the Porter household and lived as Jimmy's mistress. So she embodies in a very complex way the mutability of middle-class morality and how it's sort of plastic in its quality. It's mutable. So she started off being a very Christian woman, a very model woman who had a very sort of black and white idea of right and wrong. So she came across as someone who's imposing, she came across as someone who's pro-establishment. But we see how quickly that mutates into a different kind of embodiment, a different kind of gendered identity. So she, Helena Charles, she represents to a great extent the middle class and the mutable morality that pervades Look Back in Anger. So now we find her sort of having lived with Jimmy, having lived in with Jimmy for a considerable period of time, and having had no qualms, being Jimmy's mistress. Now we find her suddenly going back to this very Christian, moralistic, middle-class woman when the wife, Allison, the rightful wife, comes back to sort of not to claim her place, but to assert her presence. And this is where Helena leaves the play. And so she has no qualms whatsoever in being a middle-class woman again, a middle-class model woman again. Right? So this is the setting of the scene, that Allison had come back, and also we are informed in the play that Allison had come back having suffered a miscarriage. So she's lost a child, and there's also a hint that she has lost the possibility of becoming a mother again. So she's obviously very distraught. She's gone through a very serious and distressful medical condition. She's come back, she's confused, and she doesn't know why she's back. And this is why the gender politics of the play sort of reappear again, and we kind of see what kind of masculinity Jimmy Porter represents. So we have a conversation, a very interesting conversation between the two women, where they talk about the historical location of Jimmy's masculinity. We talk a little bit of this in the previous class as well, but we'll spend more time in some details looking at that particular episode in the scene. And obviously the play ends with a sort of a quasi-closure. It's not really a closure, but it's a quasi-closure. It's a very sort of a pathetic, anticlimactic, exhausted ending that we see in Look Back in Anger, where it's neither tragic nor comic, by no means is it romantic, but we find, Jimmy, quote-unquote, accepting Allison back again. And again, we talked about this in some details in the previous class, how suffering in Look Back in Anger is very, very male, how suffering is very, very gendered. So Allison comes back and she claims that she has suffered having lost a child. And this suffering, paradoxically, quote-unquote, elevates her to the level of Jimmy. So again, we look at the very, very sexist notion of suffering. How suffering, melancholia, anger, these are sort of very manly, masculine attributes in Look Back in Anger. And it's only after a woman suffers that she can be a compatible companion to a man like Jimmy Porter, which is obviously a very, very problematic reading, which is something which is embedded in the play, and we need to unpack it, we need to critique it, and we need to sort of engage with that reading in some detail, especially if we're looking at the play from the perspective of gender studies. Now, this particular scene, it opens with Jimmy's jazz trumpet. Now, again, I had spent some time, and I talked about the symbolism in the play, how Jimmy wears a tweed jacket, he smokes a pipe, he reads the news of the world, and he speaks in a very posh, university educated rhetoric, and all that comes together in sort of sort of creating or giving an image of an aspiration that Jimmy has. So despite his working class origins, the fact that he's been to university, that sort of gives him, encourages him to imagine that he can aspire to be a middle class person, he can aspire to be a middle class genteel person. But of course we know that he cannot be a genteel person, he cannot be a gentleman in a proper sense, because he doesn't have the financial capital. So he may have acquired the cultural capital by going to university, but obviously he doesn't have the necessary or the compulsory financial capital which would really take him to becoming a gentleman, and that's something we see in someone like Nigel Redfern, who's Alison's brother, who has had, we are told, who has absolutely no credentials, who has no quality in being what he is. But his only quality is, his only achievement is he's born into a family which offers him an automatic experience of entitlement. So he's entitled to privilege, he's entitled to political privilege, he's entitled to a posh education, he's entitled to all kinds of very, very middle class privileged access to power, authority, etc. But we find in this particular scene, if you just read a little bit, we find the sound of Jimmy's jazz trumpet coming in. So this is a recurring quality in Look Back in Anger. So even when Jimmy is not there physically in the scene, so he's a background presence. So it's never not there in Look Back in Anger. Even when the other characters discussing him, even when, for instance, the only scene in which he's not physically around is Act 2, Scene 2, where Alison and Colonel Redfern, they talk. They have a conversation. This is where Alison was about to leave. But even in that conversation, Jimmy occupies a central position. They talk about him endlessly, right? And we see in a very interesting way how the colonel seems to have some kind of an empathy for Jimmy. He sort of appreciates what Jimmy has, quote-unquote, taught Alison. So he sees the transformation of his own daughter, and he attributes his transformation to Jimmy's experience, Jimmy's teaching, quote-unquote teaching. So again, we find even when he's not there physically, he's there as some kind of a background presence and never really goes away. So a jazz trumpet in this particular scene is very, very important. So it sort of keeps playing in the background when the two women talk to each other, and obviously they're talking about Jimmy almost entirely, right? Okay, so if I just sort of go through certain lines, some of the selected lines in this particular scene, they're interesting. This is where Allison tells Helena that, oh, why am I here? I should not have come here. You must all wish me 1,000 miles away. To which Helena replies, I don't wish anything of that kind. You have more right to be here than I. So again, the word right is operative. That's the operative word away, the word right. So again, we find Helena sort of vacillating back to the middle class position, the middle class moral position, where she's very clear about right or wrong. She's very clear about who has more right and who has less right. And this is a complete contrast to the kind of femininity that she had embodied previously when she was Jimmy's mistress, when she was living in with him, which was a femininity which was completely had nothing to do with morality, nothing to do with Christianity, nothing to do with middle class values or mores. But now she finds it very convenient to go back to that kind of a moral system of black and white, right and wrong, Christian and unchristian, etc. And the tone, her rhetoric becomes very, very middle class as well, as we'll find very, very quickly. So, Helena says, you have more right to be here than I, to which Allison replies, interestingly, that, oh, Helena, don't bring out the book of rules. Now, this is interesting because Allison, obviously, as we know, she grew up, she was born in an imperial family, she grew up in an imperial family, so she's obviously middle class by default. She was born into middle class privilege, she was born into middle class morality. But we find that at this point of the play, by this time in the play, she is completely exhausted of morality. She's sort of liquidated of morality. And now we find her voicing a kind of moral system, a kind of philosophy which has got nothing to do with morality at all. So she says, quite unequivocally, please don't bring out the book of rules. So this is something she says to Helena in complete contrast to the kind of femininity that they had embodied earlier. Right? It's a kind of reversal of the feminine embodiment. So Helena, to which Helena replies that you are his wife, aren't you? Whatever I have done, I haven't been able to forget that fact. Now this is a complete kind of a revelation, because this sort of reveals to us that despite having been Jimmy's mistress, despite having lived in with him for a period of time, Helena had never ceased to be the middle class woman. So she's never been able to forget the fact that she is, what she is doing an act of transgression, what she's doing an act of violation of middle class morality. So she says that, you know, despite what I've done, despite what has happened, I've never been able to forget the fact that, you know, you are his wife, where I am not. So you have more of a, you know, legal right, you have more of an emotional right, you have more of a quote-unquote divine right to be here than I will ever have. Okay, so this is a very complex transformation we find in Helena, in a complete contrast to what she had been exhibiting as Jimmy's mistress earlier. Okay, now we find, interestingly, the two women, as I mentioned, they start talking about the man. They start talking about Jimmy Porter immediately. So a large part of the conversation, you know, is about Jimmy. So despite the fact that he's not really present physically in this particular situation, but that doesn't stop the people about, you know, from talking about him. This is something we saw even in the scene where, you know, the Colonel Redfern had appeared and talked to you know, his daughter Allison. So again, we find Jimmy was being recurrently referenced. So there's a recurrent reference to Jimmy even in that conversation. But here he's present, obviously, in the next room, in the adjoining room, where he's playing the jazz trumpet. So he's sort of acoustically present. His presence is being felt through the jazz trumpet. And the two women talk about him endlessly, and they sort of discuss him, the kind of masculinity he represents, the futility of that kind of masculinity, the ineffectual quality of his masculinity. So these have been discussed with the woman. And again, this becomes quite complex from the lenses of gender studies, because, you know, these are two women who obviously have lots of reasons to be grieved by Jimmy, especially Allison. But we find out not really complaining about Jimmy, but actually supporting Jimmy, actually appreciating Jimmy, actually empathizing Jimmy, which is something of a very, very, very interesting reading that we can do in this particular situation, right? So Helena talks to, I mean, she sort of lambasts Allison and tells her that, you know, you are talking in a way as if he were a book that you're passing around to other women. So we find this is a bit of a quasi-objectification of Jimmy. So the male subject is being objectified away. The two women talk about him, they discuss him, and they romanticize him, but they also reify him to a certain extent. So reification is obviously to convert something into a commodity, to convert something into an object, a commodity, right? So there's a certain degree of reification which takes place over here, which is interesting, because it's a male who is being reified in a discussion in an exchange between two women in this situation. So Helena tells Allison that you talk as if he were a book or something that you pass around to anyone who happens to want it for 5 minutes. And then she says, what's the matter with you? You sound as though you are quoting him all the time. Now, this is interesting. You're quoting him all the time. Now, we talked about how language is very gendered in Look Back in Anger. Rhetoric is very gendered in Look Back in Anger. So the fact that Allison is quoting Jimmy at this point in time obviously suggests the fact that she is being quote-unquote baptized by his kind of masculinity, baptized by his kind of moral system, right? So this is a kind of invasion, a rhetorical invasion, if you will, into Allison's imaginary. So she's quoting Jimmy all the time. She's speaking in a way that which seems to be Jimmy's voice, and Helena recognizes it. So she, criticizes Allison for that. She says that, why are you quoting him? It looks as if you're quoting him all the time. So again, the male presence, the educated rhetoric of the male is something which informs the conversation between the two women, even in this, this situation. And this is interesting because, we talked about how we saw in how in Heart of Darkness, knowledge was gendered. We saw how in Shatrangya Khilari, political presence, political agency was gendered. Women had no agency whatsoever. And now we see in Look Back in Anger how language is gendered, how rhetoric is gendered, how emotions become gendered, how hysteria becomes gendered. It's sort of re-gendered in a way, because we find over here an example of a male hysteric. So Jimmy is the most hysteric person in this particular play. He's absolutely hysterical. He's neurotic, he's hysterical, he breaks down. He has meltdowns very, very often. He screams, he's petulant, he's pejorative. So it's all that put together. But then, of course, he sort of disguises his hysteria. He sort of masquerades as an angry young man, which is a very thinly disguised way of representing his hysteria. So if you just scratch the surface, if you take away the anger, if you take away the angry rhetoric, what we find is a completely broken, hysterical man. And obviously, there is a sense of emasculation that he embodies. There's a sense of emasculation that he suffers, and we talked about how his misogyny, Jimmy's misogyny, the fact that he can't stand women, and he can't stand women, he's threatened by women, he's threatened by a powerful, assertive woman. But that seems to come from a certain kind of a traumatic experience he had as a child, when he obviously saw his father die, and he was at his deathbed all the time when the mother was not there. The absent mother becomes a permanent presence in Jimmy Porter's emotional imaginary, emotional landscape. So the absent mother is a permanent presence. She never goes away. So the absence of the mother is permanent in Jimmy Porter, and that's what informs, to a large extent, his misogyny, his his anxiety about the woman, etc. Now, what we find over here is that Allison seems to be completely baptized by Jimmy. So she seems to be someone who's completely controlled by Jimmy, rhetorically, emotionally, etc. And this is something Helena recognizes immediately. She's a very clever, intuitive, middle-class woman who very quickly recognizes the fact that Allison seems to be quoting Jimmy all the time. So the language that Allison is speaking, seems to be informed by Jimmy's education, informed by Jimmy's worldview, informed by Jimmy's philosophy of life. So that's something that she reproaches Allison for. So, and then she goes back, Helena goes back saying that, despite the fact that I've lived here all these months, I had never for a moment not known that what I'm doing is wrong. It's not right, it's incorrect, that I have no right to be here. What I'm doing is an act of transgression, what I'm doing is an act of violation, an act of violence, violence in the moral system, and this is something that have been plaguing my mind for a long time. Despite the fact that I seem to have enjoyed my experience over here, erotically enjoyed my experience over here, because she was obviously in a live-in relationship with Jimmy, and there was very clearly an indication of physical intimacy and lust between the two of them. But despite that, the emotional register, the moral register of Helena, has been largely unchanged. So she is, again, this brings us back to the notion of performativity. So she has never ceased to be the middle-class woman, but she just performed the role of a quote-unquote non-middle-class, amoral woman, someone who doesn't really conform to the middle-class mores. So this play between conformity and performativity is something which is very interesting in Look Back in Anger, especially if you're looking at it from a gender studies perspective. So she starts off being a conformist, and then obviously Helena, she breaks away from that, she departs from that conformist position through her performativity, right? So again, the play between conformity and performativity is something which happens in Look Back in Anger a lot, especially in relation to the gendered identities as they evolve in the play. And now we come to the very interesting section in Look Back in Anger in the end, where the two women discuss Jimmy, they measure him up historically, they measure him up in terms of his masculinity, and they discuss how ineffectual he is. They sort of romanticize him to a large extent, and they seem to agree, they seem to have some kind of a consensus about their idea of Jimmy, about the idea of his ineffectuality, about his masculinity, and how it's something which will never really be anything, never really become anything. Okay, and this is what they say to each other. This is Helena telling Allison, I have discovered what is wrong with Jimmy. It's very simple, really. He was born out of his time. Okay, so again, this trying to suggest, say that Jimmy is someone who is just, he doesn't really have any good, brave causes left. To be honorable, to be heroic. And this is something Jimmy had said himself, that there aren't any good, brave causes left. All the good causes have been exhausted, which is untrue, as we know, because this is a time where the Cold War is being fought, the Cold War has begun to reach its climax, and then of course we have other situations like the Suez Canal crisis, and of course the Cuba Missile Crisis will happen very, very shortly. The Falkland War is imminent. So all these international political situations are quite pervasive in this particular the context of the play, the historical background of the play. But despite that, Jimmy likes to romanticize the past and says that all the glorious causes have been exhausted by the past. So he can only look back in anger at the past, which has exhausted him of causes. So standing where he is in the moment, he doesn't seem to see any good, brave causes left to die for. And a woman in this play, Alison and Helena, they seem to agree with that proposition, they seem to agree with that assumption that Jimmy is born, out of his time. And then they go on to say, a little romantically perhaps, that there's no place for people like that any longer. in sex or politics or anything. So he's erotically ineffectual, he's politically ineffectual, and again, this is something which we saw even in Shatanshikilari. So when we talk about the productivity of the two men in Shatanshikilari, we saw that both the men are childless, they don't seem to have any children, and this can be equated very interestingly with the political importance of the men. They really are powerless, they're important politically, so the British come and they run away immediately without offering any resistance whatsoever. So again, this very interesting confluence between two different kinds of embodiment, the political embodiment and the biological embodiment, is something which you find in Look Back in Anger as well. So they say quite clearly, the two women, that Jimmy has no place, someone like Jimmy has no place in sex or politics, which is obviously indicative of the fact that he's a completely wasted product. So he's a waste from the past, who is not useful anymore in any domain of life. So then Helena goes on to say, that's why he's so futile. Sometimes when I listen to him, I feel he thinks he's still in the middle of the French Revolution, and that is where he ought to be, of course. He doesn't know where he is or where he's going. He'll never do anything and he'll never amount to anything. So this statement about Jimmy's ineffectuality, the fact that he'll never do anything, he'll never amount to anything, he'll always be an ineffectual intellectual, an ineffectual quasi-working class hero, is something that Helena has very quickly discerned, right? And she articulates it, and Allison seems to agree with it completely and immediately. And she says, and this brings us a very important point about the masculinity of Jimmy Porter, because he seems to be emblematic to a certain extent of the ineffectual masculinity of post-imperial England. So he embodies an order of masculinity which is rhetorical, which is sort of quasi-intellectual, but thoroughly ineffectual, right? So he cannot move anything, he cannot bring about any change, any real change, positive or whatsoever. All he can do is sit and waste away, with his life, with his possibilities, etc. And obviously the sense of waste comes back and Look Back in Anger at the end with the figure of the dead child, the child who never appears in the play, which is basically, obviously, an emblem of the wasted humanity, right? The child, the lost child of Alison. And of course, we are also told that she has lost the possibility of becoming a mother again, which is obviously some kind of a closure that the play ends with, right? A closure which suggests a liquidation, exhaustion, and the impossibility of a future, the impossibility of the futurelessness of England to a certain extent. So this is something which Helena seems to say over here quite clearly. And she says that he'll never do anything, never amount to anything. So again, this very interesting way to look at Jimmy's masculinity becomes quite political immediately, because as you saw at the beginning of the play, and as I've been saying throughout the lectures about this play, that we need to be very, very aware of the confluence between the personal and the political in Look Back in Anger, right? So the personal predicament in Look Back in Anger, that Jimmy doesn't have a job, a proper job, despite his university education. Jimmy's angry at the past. Jimmy doesn't seem to do anything, or cannot seem to do anything, and obviously is completely consumed by the inertia, by the tiredness, by the inaction around him. And all this personal atmosphere, the personal predicament, as I just said, is quite clearly a pointer to the political predicament that England suffers at this point of time. So having lost the empire, having lost the imperial position, having lost the privileged position in politics, England, like Jimmy Porter, is essentially a liquidated entity. It's an exhausted entity. It can just scream from its present. It can just look back frontally with nostalgia, anger, bitterness, envy, glory, etc. But it doesn't really have a future to look forward to, which is obviously symbolized by the lost child, the child who doesn't appear and look back in anger. Right? So again, this is the point I want you to be aware of. The constant confluence between the personal and the political and Look Back in Anger. That's something that that happens in the play quite often. So it's not really ostensibly political. So it's not really foregrounding, the end of the empire. It's not really foregrounding, the Suez Canal crisis, the Cuba Missile crisis, the Falkland War. It's not really foregrounding all these things at all. But it's sort of, the entire action takes place, as you know, inside a closed apartment, with no exception whatsoever. But despite this closeness, this personal quality in Look Back in Anger, we find it sort of obviously extends onto some very rich and interesting political readings, which we can decode in the play. So the very embodiment of Jimmy Porter is a political condition, right? So when Helena says he'll never do anything, he'll never amount to anything, what she's essentially saying is that that class of people, that generation of men of which Jimmy is a part of, will all suffer the same predicament. They'll never do anything, they'll never amount to anything. They can just be ineffectual intellectuals, sitting at the present, in a very, very problematically located in the present, and looking back at the past with anger. Okay? So he'll never do anything, he'll never amount to anything. So, and then Alison's response is equally interesting. So she says, I suppose he's what you call an eminent Victorian, slightly comic in a way. We seem to have this conversation, have had this conversation before, right? So interestingly, Alison says he's a bit of an eminent Victorian. So by eminent Victorian, she obviously means that Jimmy might be seen, maybe seen as a parody of some kind of Victorian masculinity. He wants to sort of live that kind of masculinity even now. So hence his street jacket, his pipe, his Sunday newspapers, his intellectual observations of society, etc. So all these are very Victorian attributes, very Victorian habits. But what he doesn't realize, or what he fails to understand, or fails to locate, is the fact that time has moved on, and there's no place for someone like him. So there is a comic quality about Jimmy, which Alison very cleverly and very intuitively decodes and articulates. So she says quite unequivocally, there is a comic quality about Jimmy's ineffectuality. The fact that his gendered identity, with all this hysteria, anger, rhetoric, bitterness, cynicism, also contains a degree of comicality, inadvertent comicality. Obviously, he's not deliberately comic, but he ends up being comic by his ineffectuality, by his futility for any kind of change. His complete agency-lessness makes him sort of comic in a particular way. And we can relate this again to what we saw in Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, where too there's a tragic comic quality about Orwell's human predicament. So he doesn't want to shoot the elephant, but he has to because he sees around him thousands of Burmese men and women crowded to consume his performativity, crowded to consume to his imperial masculinity. And then he shoots the elephant against his will, and he confesses in the end that does it only to avoid looking like a fool. So there's a comic quality to the whole enterprise. But obviously it's tragicomic, it's very dark comic quality, and that's something similar we find in Jimmy Porter's masculinity as well. And it's something which is told by his wife, someone who's observed him very, very closely, okay? And someone who suffered his presence very, very closely. And then obviously Helena tells Allison that I'm going back, so she's leaving. She doesn't want to stay as Jimmy's mistress anymore now that Allison's come back. So the very presence of the very appearance of Allison to Helena signifies or indicates an impossibility of continuity, an impossibility of continuation as Jimmy's mistress. And she says quite unequivocally, I believe in good and evil, and I don't have to apologize for that. It's quite a modern scientific belief now, so they tell me. And by everything I have ever believed in or wanted, what I have been doing is wrong and evil. So again, notice the rhetoric. This is a typical middle class, the voice of middle class femininity. So again, we cannot possibly look at the gender identity, the gender question in Look Back in Anger without considering the class question. So the class question and the gender question coming together all the time. So for instance, if we look at Cliff, Jimmy's best friend, someone who stays with them in a very complex relationship. Cliff, Jimmy, and Allison, they seem to stay together. And you find him, he too is Jimmy's friend. I mean, he's Jimmy's friend. They come from a similar kind of class origin, but because he hasn't been to university, he doesn't have the rhetorical Jimmy Porter. He hasn't acquired the rhetorical middle class masculinity, the middle class gentility. So he's purely working class, right? So he's more comfortably located in his class. Whereas Jimmy, as we know, is sort of very, very uncomfortable with his class position, with his social position, doesn't really have a position. He's not completely working class, he's not completely middle class either. So somewhere of a no man's land stuck between the two. And Alison and Helena over here, they obviously are very, very typical middle class women, and Helena tells Allison quite unequivocally at this point that she wants to go back into becoming a middle-class woman. So she's played a part, she's performed the role of an immoral mistress, and now she believes in good and evil, and she believes it's a scientific belief, and she wants to go back and subscribe and resubscribe to that idea of the binaristic understanding of good and evil, okay, wrong and evil. And then the two of them have another conversation about Jimmy, where Allison tells Helena, he wants something quite different from us. What is exactly, I don't know. What it is exactly, I don't know. A kind of cross between a mother and a Greek courtesan, a henchwoman, a mixture of Cleopatra and Boswell. Boswell, obviously, the reference to the biographer Samuel Johnson, So he represents, he embodies a certain degree of psychophancy, a certain degree of flattery, right? And Cleopatra obviously represents or embodies a certain degree of dominance, political dominance, erotic dominance, etc. So it's a combination, and this is something we have been seeing since the very beginning of the play, that Jimmy is a disconcerting mixture of attributes, opposite attributes. So cruelty and malice and sincerity and tenderness and kindness all stay together in Jimmy and give him this very complex character, which doesn't really make him a hero or a villain, but is somewhere an anti-hero in theatre. He's one of the finest anti-heroes in British theatre, especially written at this particular time. So again, that makes him quite comparable to Hamlet, because we never know with Hamlet whether Hamlet is a pure hero or a villain. We never quite know, we never get to know, and it's a very complex and open play in that category. Right? So the two women talk to each other, and Allison says quite clearly that we don't know what he wants. He wants something very different from the woman. And again, the desire from the woman is quite complex over here. And the two women talk about the man and how his desire needs to be understood. Right? And again, there's a degree of double objectification over here. So on the one hand, they're talking about Jimmy, measuring him up, measuring his attributes, his intellectual attributes, his emotional attributes, and that obviously objectifies him to a certain extent. But then again, the content of the conversation objectifies the woman. So they seem to agree over here that Jimmy wants something from a woman which we cannot give. So he wants a mixture of Cleopatra, the domineering quality of Cleopatra, and the psychophancy of Boswell. He wants a henchwoman and a mother, a Greek courtesan and a mother. So all these different kinds of attributes, erotic attributes, emotional attributes, tenderness, etc., they all come together and feed Jimmy's attitude towards women, which these women seem to understand. So it is an example of double objectification. This is something that I need you to aware of, especially if you're looking at gender studies. So identity, the gender identity over here is objectified. So on the one hand, they're objectifying Jimmy's desire. So that's the masculinity being objectified. And secondly, on the other hand, the content of the desire objectifies the female. So it's a double objectification in that sense. Now, this is a section where Helena leaves. So she sort of tells quite clearly and immediately, without any equivocation, that she would like to catch the 7:15 train to London, and she realizes now that she cannot carry on being Jimmy's mistress, and she's decided once and for all. She's completely convinced that what she has done is wrong and incorrect, and she should be punished for it. So she sort of made a decision, a moral decision, to go back to morality. Okay, and notice again how this departure from the quote-unquote immoral position and this return to the moral position immediately has its signifiers at a structural environmental level. So when Helena has gone back and Jimmy and Allison, they have a conversation, we have an instance of the church bells ringing outside. Okay, so again, the voice of the church bells, the sound of the church bells obviously signify the sound of establishment, the sound of religion, the sound of comfort and closure and meaning at a material, spiritual level. Okay, so this is something which Jimmy antagonizes. So Jimmy is the ontological opposite of all this, right? So the church bells can be seen as a contrast to Jimmy's jazz trumpet, which obviously is a voice, sound of protest, the sound of anti-establishment, the sound of anger, whereas the church bells signify the sound of meaning, calmness, wisdom, establishment, etc. So this constant tension between two different kinds of soundscapes, the two different orders of sound, is something which is very interesting and look back in anger. So, so this is Jimmy and Allison conversing with each other, and Jimmy is trying to very softly tell Allison about suffering, etc. When he says, "It's no good trying to fool yourself about love. You can't fall into it like a soft job without dirtying your hands." He hands her the makeup things, which she takes. He opens the wardrobe, takes out a dress on a hanger. And if you can't bear the thought of messing up your nice, clean soul, crossing back to the hand, you'd better give up the whole idea of life and become a saint. Puts the dress in her arms, because you'll never make it as a human being in either this world or the next. Right? So he's sort of very gently reprimanding Allison for escaping from her position, escaping from our gender identity. So he says to Allison that, Helena's gone away, and you're going to go away as well, probably. So, you should all become saints. You should all become non-mainstream people, because if you can't stand suffering, if you can't experience suffering, if you can't learn from suffering, you cannot really be a normal human being. And again, look at the way how the very attribute of suffering is masculinized over here. So suffering is supposed to elevate you and man you up to a great extent, right? So that goes back to the old adage that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That kind of an adage, that kind of a rhetoric is being voiced by Jimmy over here. It's a very manly, masculinist kind of rhetoric, and supremely sexist at several levels, because Allison's suffering is biological, emotional, as well as existential, right? But the only purpose that seems to serve in Jimmy's imagination, that seems to elevate her and make her good enough, compatible enough for Jimmy, which is a very objectifying way, a very patronizing way to look at Allison and her suffering and her experiences. But interestingly and tragically, I think, Allison seems to agree with this kind of a reading. She seems to subscribe to this kind of a reading that Jimmy subjects her to, right? And then he goes on to say, the heaviest, strongest creatures in this world seem to be the loneliest, like the old bear following his own breath in a dark forest. There's no warm pack, no herd to comfort him. That voice that cries out doesn't have to be the weaklings, does it? Right? So the symbolism of the bear and the squirrel is interesting over here, and that's the symbolism with which Look Back in Anger ends, and we'll look at it in some detail in a minute. But what it does essentially is that it sort of extends the gendered performativity of Jimmy and Allison. So Jimmy sort of performs the tattered, bruised bear, who is sort of shattered and tattered and worn out and tired, etc. Whereas Allison emblematizes or embodies the tattered toy squirrel. And then both of them are tattered, both of them are shabby and worn out and tired and torn at different ends. But that sort of symbolizes them in terms of the human quality. So Jimmy is a bruised, melancholic man who is cynical, who has suffered, is not really complete, not really adequate in any sense of the word. Whereas Allison too now is inadequate as a woman because she has lost a child, and she thinks that she cannot be a woman, she cannot be a mother again, and she equates womanhood with femininity, with motherhood altogether, right? And that again is a very moral position, a very middle-class moral position to take, right? And she thinks that because she's lost the privilege, she's lost the biological agency of becoming a mother, now she has truly suffered, and this suffering has elevated her, has made her compatible in terms of companionship with Jimmy, right? And that's what she seems to say at this point, and that's a thought which brings them together in the end. But the bear and the squirrel symbolism is interesting because it's sort of at a very gendered level. The bear represents a certain kind of masculinity, the toy bear, the teddy bear which is there in a household, which is torn, which is unclean, which is sort of shattered and torn at the edges. That represents in many ways the incomplete, the inadequate masculinity represented by Jimmy or embodied by Jimmy. Whereas the tattered toy squirrel, which is not really new, not really tidy, not really beautiful, that represents Allison, especially now that she's come back, bruised and beaten by life. Okay, and that symbolism now becomes very, very potent at this point of time. Right. So Jimmy goes on to say, you seem to have, do you remember the first night I saw you at the grizzly party? You seem to have a wonderful relaxation of spirit. I knew that was what I wanted. You've got to be really brawny to have that kind of strength to relax. It was only after we were married that I discovered that it wasn't relaxation at all. In order to relax, you first got to sweat your guts out. So again, we were talking about the very masculinist desire that Jimmy has for the woman. So he wants a woman who can relax. And the word relax away is a very loaded word. The relaxation, according to Jimmy, can only come with suffering, can only come with experience, can only come with agony, right? So he confesses away, he had mistaken Allison's naivete as for relaxation. So Allison was naive, Allison was innocent, and he thought that was relaxation. Only after they were married, he realized that he had been cheated of his purpose. That Allison isn't really relaxed at all because she hasn't really suffered life, she hasn't really seen life in any aspect. And that's what he says to her quite clearly at this point in the play. And then he says he did not really sweat anything. He never experienced suffering, or never experienced life in the proper sense, so he never knew how to relax. So I was mistaken. So I was cheated on my purpose, right? And Alison's response is quite interesting over here. She says, it doesn't matter. I was wrong. I was wrong. I don't want to be neutral. I don't want to be saint. I want to be a lost cause. I want to be corrupt and futile. Now this corruption and futility that Allison talks about is quite interesting, because that again becomes a gendered identity. So she doesn't want, she thinks she cannot be a complete woman anymore. She's a corrupted woman now, because she's lost a child and she's lost the ability to become a mother again. So in her own imagination, in her own moral system, she has become a corrupted woman, a futile woman, and she she wants the corruption, she wants the futility. So what brings them together at this point of the play is inadequate gendered identities. And this is interesting. I'll say it again. What brings them together at this point of the play is inadequate gendered identity, the admission of the inadequate gendered identities. So Jimmy says, I'm a lost cause. Jimmy says, I'm ineffectual, I'll never be anything. Where Allison says, I'm a lost cause as well, because I'm futile, I'm corrupted now. I'm no longer a saint, I'm no longer sitting on the fence, I'm no longer politically correct. I've taken the plunge, I have suffered violence, I've suffered loss, and now I'm corrupt and futile, and now I'm ready to be human in Jimmy's sense of the word. So she's tattered enough as a woman, she is tired enough as a woman, she is beaten enough as a woman, bruised enough as a woman to become Jimmy's wife. So again, this entire reading, as I'm just studying you, is extremely problematic and quite sexist in many ways, because what is being said over here essentially is that Allison's suffering elevates her, helps her to man up and face life, and now Jimmy can embrace her back as a compatible companion, which is a very problematic reading, as you'll agree. Okay, so and then she goes on to say, I am in the fire and I'm burning, and all I want is to die. It's cost him his child and any others that I might have had, but what does it matter? This is what he wanted from me. Right? So speaking of Jimmy in third person over here, and says, so I came back over here because I wanted you to see me in this condition, because this is what he wanted of me. This is what he wanted to sort of see me in. As someone is suffering, someone who has suffered life, someone is exhausted, someone who can now be your compatible companion. So interestingly, from a perspective of gender studies, what we find is Jimmy's inadequate masculinity now finds a companion in Allison's understanding of her own inadequate femininity, right? So again, as I said just a second earlier, the inadequacy is a commonality over here, as a connecting factor between these two people over here. So the inadequate gendered identities that they have at the moment is what brings them together. So Jimmy's always been inadequate socially, intellectually, class-wise, etc. And Allison's now inadequate, so now they can be together again. So gendered compatibility sort of is premised on inadequacy. Okay. So, and then Jimmy's response obviously is unsurprising. He says, you're all right now, right? And then he sort of quote unquote accepts her back, and then goes on to say, we'll be together in our bear's cave on a squirrel's day. And we'll live on honey and nuts, lots and lots of nuts. And we'll sing songs about ourselves, about warm trees and snock caves and lying in the sun. And we'll keep those big eyes on my fur and help me keep my claws in order, because I'm a bit of a soppy, scruffy sort of bear. And I'll see that you keep that sleek, bushy tail glistening as it should, because you are a very beautiful squirrel, but you are none too bright either. So you've got to be careful. There are cruel steel straps lying about everywhere, just waiting for rather mad, slightly satanic, and very timid little animals. So what it's essentially saying is, we are not going to be real anymore. So we're now withdrawing into this very playful landscape of bear and squirrel, the playful landscape of performativity, right? So we'll perform the bear and the squirrel, and this is how we're going to last our lives, live our lives in the times to come. So there are these real traps out there who can, which can, enmesh us any second. So I'll protect you with my inadequacy, you'll protect me with your inadequacy, and that's how we'll be together as a gendered identity together, right? So you'll be, what we find over here is an example of extension. Extended embodiment. So the bear becomes an extended embodiment of Jimmy, whereas the squirrel becomes an extended embodiment of Allison. And of course, as I mentioned, both orders of embodiment are inadequate orders of embodiment, right? So they take pride now, so that the happiness is in the inadequacy. So Jimmy says quite clearly, I'll protect you because I'm a sloppy bear, and you should protect me, and I'll protect you because you're not a very bright squirrel. You're very beautiful, but you're not very bright. Which is, again, if you look at the adjectives used over here, it's very, very binaristic in a very sexist kind of a way. So Jimmy says, I'm an ugly bear, and I'm very shabby and and soppy, scruffy, so I need you to protect me. Whereas you are a very beautiful squirrel, you have a glistening tail, but you're not very bright. So you're beautiful but dumb, and I am unbeautiful, non-beautiful but intelligent, which is, again, a very typical sexist binary with which Jimmy sort of brings about this closure, okay? And of course, that sort of brings them together in a very tragic comic kind of an ending. And then, Allison nods, she seems to agree, and Jimmy says, poor squirrels. Allison with the same comic emphasis. So this is interesting. The word comic comes over here. It's a very loaded word over here. And she says, poor bears. She laughs a little, then looks at him very tenderly and adds very, very softly, oh, poor bears. Slides her arms around him, curtain. Okay, so the play ends literally, Look Back in Anger ends with the curtain coming in after the assertion of performativity, right? So Jimmy asserts that he'll play the bear, Allison asserts that she'll play the squirrel, and that becomes an extension of their gendered identities, the very bruised, inadequate gendered identities with which the assertion and the acknowledgement and the articulation with which Look Back in Anger ends, right? So, as you may have guessed by now, it's an extremely complex play, especially if you're looking at it from a gender studies perspective. So the political landscape is very complex. The private landscape is very, very complex. In a way, the two landscapes are dialoguing with each other. How the political and the personal engage with each other and Look Back in Anger. How the political becomes the personal, how the personal becomes the political is something which we find repeatedly in this particular play, right? So it's an extremely complex play because what it does is it brings into play all the critical terms which we studied. So there's mimicry. Jimmy is trying to mimic a certain kind of behavior. There's performativity. Helena is trying to perform a certain kind of behavior. So despite being a middle-class model woman, she's trying to perform the seductress who lives in with Jimmy. Right, and obviously the performance comes to an end, and as I keep saying throughout this particular lecture series that we had on Look Back in Anger, we should never forget the fact that she's a professional actress, right? So we never quite know when her organic embodiment is replaced by a more artificially performative embodiment, and to what extent are these two symmetrically linked, these two orders of embodiment, rather linked at all, okay? So we never quite know. So again, we find, the other kinds of theoretical terms which we studied, hegemonic gender identity. For instance, once upon a time, someone like Colonel Redfern may have been powerful at a political level, but now he's come back to a post-imperial England, and because of the end of imperialism, he's not really the big boss anymore. And again, we can compare Redfern with Mansfield's boss. Both men seem to have fallen from positions of power, right? So because the world around them has changed. First World War has happened in a case of Mansfield's boss. The First World War had innervated him, exhausted him, taken away his son and the possibility of his permanence. And likewise, the Second World War has happened in Look Back in Anger, at the end of which England has ceased to be an imperial power, it ceased to be an imperial nation, and now it's become an exhausted nation. It's no longer a global player in politics, and that is something which is symbolized heavily in the embodiment, or the inadequate embodiment, or the altered embodiment, as represented by Colonel Redfern. So all these terms, identity, embodiment, mimicry, performativity, agency, all these terms come together and Look Back in Anger in very complex combinations, and makes this play, which makes this play a very, very interesting study of gender identity in a political situation. I hope you enjoyed reading Look Back in Anger with me. I suggest you read the whole play in more details. And obviously, there'll be questions in the play, but this is the kind of play, personally, I think this is a play which stays with you, which grows with you. Every time you go back to it, you sort of reread it in a new way, and you find new meanings to it. Because, it's a very flawed play with a very flawed protagonist. It's hardly a perfect play, it hardly has a perfect protagonist, but it's sort of interesting and complex because of its flawed quality, because of its inadequate quality, which makes it a very, very open text, especially for those of us interested in gender studies. So thank you for attending the classes on Look Back in Anger, and I'll see you in the subsequent classes who will take up a different topic. Thank you for your attention.